Welcome, intrepid historians. When we last left off, Britain and the 13 colonies were reveling in their victory in the French and Indian War. Everyone was loving the new young king, George III. Colonists were particularly pleased that in this war they had got what they wanted for. The rich farmland of the Ohio Valley now belongs to Britain. Unfortunately, their celebration is interrupted by yet another war. This one, called Pontiac's War, begins immediately. I mean, there's like no break in between. French and Indian War ends, Pontiac's War begins. The British call this a rebellion. What's happening is Native Americans who live around the Great Lakes are sad that the French lost the war and are unhappy that the British now are claiming authority in their region. They know that the French were chill, just wanted, the French largely let the Indians keep their land, just wanted to trade furs. The Indians know that the British push them aside and take their land, farm on it, and so the Great Lakes Indians believe that since the British are probably tired of fighting by now, they figure this is their chance to strike and prevent the British from getting any foothold in their area. So the goal here for the Indians is to keep the British off their land. It's called Pontiac's War, named after a chief named Pontiac, leader of the Ottawa people. And though he starts it with a raid on a British fort and is one of many important leaders in this war, he's not running the whole show, right? Pretty much all of the tribes in the region were fighting to keep the British out, and when the British were sort of hoping Pontiac was in charge, they end up buying him off. They basically bribe him to stop fighting, and he takes the money. And the British are like, "Yay, we're done!" But the other native tribes fight on, and in fact, the Ottawa keep fighting. One of the things that always frustrated the British and later the Americans was that they imagined that an Indian chief was, sort of like a king, and that if you cut a deal with the chief, you had cut a deal with the entire tribe. But that's not how leadership worked in most Native American groups. There were many chiefs, and authority based on was sort of democratic. The chief that is going to be listened to at any given time is the one that most people are digging. And so when Pontiac gets bought off, that doesn't mean that all the Indians stop fighting, because he's not in charge anymore. Now, Pontiac, sad to say, is not a great guy. At one point, in war, people are periodically kidnapped. At one point, Pontiac kidnaps a 7-year-old girl named Betty Smith, and that's not a portrait of Betty Smith, but that's a portrait of a girl about that age from the time. And so Pontiac's keeping her as a slave, and she comes down with dysentery, which you remember is bloody diarrhea. And she has an accident and ruins some of his clothes. So he tells one of the Indians who work for him to take her down to the river and drown her, and that's what happens. So Pontiac was a pretty bad guy. Even the other Ottawa, after he gets bought off, don't much like him, and he is eventually assassinated. But meanwhile, the war rages on. The British do ultimately win. They win because, well, they still got a really good army, and they also, as we've seen by buying off Pontiac, they're trying to use diplomacy, also negotiations, to end the conflict. The If there was a strategic mistake by the natives in Pontiac's war, it was probably attacking too soon. If they had waited for British troops to leave Canada after the French and Indian War, they probably would have had an easier time of it. But since this war starts immediately on the heels of the last, British forces are still there in strength, and they can regroup and defeat the Indians. Colonial militias, not much help again in this war. They actually the militias do okay defending frontier settlements in the 13 colonies, but they're they winning Pontiac's war would mean sending military force into the Great Lakes region, and colonies still didn't want to send their militias outside their borders. The British, however, are beyond tired at this point. So during this conflict, during Pontiac's war, Parliament and King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763, which forbids colonists from settling west of the Appalachians. It creates this sort of red line. This red line runs along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, and this proclamation, this decree, says keep out of the land west of the Appalachians. Now, this is a practical measure from the British perspective. They're like, hey, we're exhausted from fighting the French and Indian War. We've got our hands full, putting down Pontiac's war, and we just don't need colonists moving west of the mountains and angering Indians and causing more wars at this time. We want to wrap up Pontiac's war, and then we want to take a breather because we've lost so many men in this war. We've spent so much money on this war. Britain's deep in debt, and they see the Proclamation of 1763 as a common sense measure to prevent future conflict anytime soon. They're like, the general British attitude is eventually, yeah, we'll push west of the Appalachians and turn that land into farmland, but for right now, people need to relax because we need to recover. The colonists feel absolutely cheated. The colonists dragged the British Empire into the French and Indian War because they wanted the rich farmland in the Ohio River Valley. And now that the French and Indian War is concluded, they're eager to go and get that land, even though Pontiac's war is raging nearby in the Great Lakes region. And so yeah, a lot of colonists are upset. They see the Proclamation of 1763 as denying them the benefits they earned in the French and Indian War. But the British don't see it that way. The British know that colonial militias were pretty useless, that the colonies didn't really earn the victory in the French and Indian War. British forces and British taxpayers did that, and they think the colonists should be able to wait a few years to claim that land. This is I mentioned before that the French and Indian War ends up changing the relationship between Britain and the 13 colonies. Proclamation 1763 is the first souring of the relationship between Britain and her colonies in North America. Now, before we leave Pontiac's War altogether, I want to talk about a significant incident in biological warfare that happened during Pontiac's rebellion. This is a famous case where the British, including the colonists, gave smallpox-infected blankets to Indians. And, by now, of course, the Europeans have noticed that Native Americans are much more susceptible to disease than they are, right? Most British people got smallpox at some point in their lives, and they generally survived. Pretty small percentage of British people died when smallpox happened. It was a little bit more of a problem with the colonists because they were less likely to live in towns and cities, so smallpox was still affecting British colonists pretty badly. But Native Americans, when smallpox hit a native village, it would generally wipe out most of the population. This is the first recorded instance where the British and the colonists intentionally infected Indians with smallpox. The thinking seemed to be, we're fighting them in a war, so and we know they're susceptible to disease, so we might as well let the disease do as much of the damage as possible. This starts with a Pennsylvania militia commander. You don't need to know his name, but his name was William Trent, and he was having a parley with Indians. And sometimes you wave a white flag and you take a break from the fighting and have a discussion, and see if you can negotiate some peace. And they didn't. And it's customary at a parley to have a small exchange of gifts, and so this Pennsylvania militia commander gave the Indians that he was talking to 2 blankets and a handkerchief that came out of the smallpox hospital. I hope it will have the desired effect. So, some British soldiers and some militiamen, had smallpox and they were recovering, and so he's taking 2 blankets and a handkerchief that have been used by smallpox patients and giving them to the Indians. Now, smallpox pus runs clear, so you wouldn't know looking at those blankets and the handkerchief that they were infectious. Back then, everybody had lower standards for what a clean garment was, because they didn't have washers and dryers and electricity in their homes like we do, so laundry was much harder to do. Anyway, the desired effect, obviously, is he's hoping that the Indians catch smallpox and die. Now, the reason we know about this is because he puts it in a letter, and he's writing the letter to the British Army, asking for compensation. He's asking for reimbursement. Hey, I gave away 2 perfectly good blankets and a perfectly good handkerchief to the Indians because I was hoping it would give them smallpox. Now I want the British Army to pay me so I can buy 2 brand new blankets and a replacement handkerchief. And the British Army approves this expense. They see this as a good and legitimate thing that the guy has done. Also, it's noteworthy that the Pennsylvania militia is filing for reimbursement from the British Army, right? Why not file for reimbursement from the Pennsylvania militia or the government of Pennsylvania? Well, because colonists hate paying taxes, and their governments are perpetually broke, but the British government is effective and can pay. So, if it was just this, that's a relatively small incident, but it goes on from there. A British general, Geoffrey Amherst, and this is the one name that I need you to remember in connection with this smallpox blanket incident. General Amherst picks up on this idea, and he writes a letter to a junior officer, somebody under his command, a guy named Colonel Bouquet. And Amherst writes, "Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among disaffected tribes of Indians? We must on this occasion use every stratagem in our power to reduce them." So, he's like, yeah, let's do this on a bigger scale. Try to infect our Indian enemies with smallpox. The goal is to reduce them, to reduce their population. Colonel Bouquet writes back. Colonel Bouquet was a Swiss mercenary. He writes, "I will try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets that may fall in their hands, taking care, however, not to get the disease myself." Now, he's using the word inoculate wrong here. Inoculation is protective. Inoculation is when you try to help somebody not get the bad version of the disease by giving them a weak version of the disease. What he meant was to infect, right? He's following Amherst's order here.